Hey, what's up, my people? John Middlekauff, new YouTube channel. What I need you to do, subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, share with your friends. Appreciate everyone that has. It's the podcast, 3 and Out. You can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Apple, Spotify. We got you covered. Also, thevolume.com. We got merch right here. FlexFit hat. Go to thevolume.com. Get yourself a 3 and Out hat. What is going on, everybody? Here was the plan that got scrapped. I was going to do a mailbag only for Friday. And then some stuff happened today. Dan Quinn, new head coach for the Commanders. We got to touch on that. Jed York said something that Kyle told him Brock Purdy's rookie season in training camp that we got to address. And then a pretty crazy article. I haven't even read it all, but something specifically jumped out in regards to the Jets and Robert Saleh that happened, and I think is a classic sign of when NFL teams get desperate, things kind of crumble. No matter how much of a culture guy you are, no matter how good of a guy you are, it can fall apart fast. And I think the Jets got major issues. So we'll dive into some topics here. We'll have a separate video for the mailbag, and we'll end our Friday on this. But obviously, before we dive into some football stuff, I got to tell you about my friends, my loyal partners, and the official ticketing app of this podcast, Gametime. Do you want to go to a game? Obviously, football's about to end. There's only one more game. If you're not going to the Super Bowl, do you want to get out and go to a college basketball game? March Madness isn't that far away, right? It comes to a lot of different cities. Do you want to go to, the first couple rounds? Do you want to go to an NBA game? Do you want to go to an NHL game? Big hockey guy, been to one game. It was awesome. Spring training. You in Arizona, you in Florida in a month, you want to enjoy yourself? Concerts, comedy shows, they got everything. Download the Gametime app. It's the easiest app I've ever used because you just type in where you live, you type in the game you want to go to, and then you search the venue, the arena, the stadium, wherever. You pick the price point, the type of money you're willing to spend, you want to spend, whatever. You pick a seat you want. It'll show you the price. It'll give you the sight lines. I did that when I went to Morgan Wallen this summer. It's like, I want to sit here. This was the sight line. Oh, that was cool. I got him for my brother for Christmas. Even though he got me the same jacket 2 years in a row, I got him front row seats at Cody Johnson, which he said was incredible with my friends at Gametime. Just download the Gametime app. Promo code JOHN. 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 I saw Live Golf. They put out a press release. They spelled John Rahm's name incorrectly. Jon. I'm J-O-H, or he's J-O-H-N. That's my name. He's J-O-N. So make sure you do J-O-H-N, old school John there, and get yourself $20 off. It's trying to help you out. Things are very expensive these days. We're all trying to save money here and there when we can. My promo code John. You've already used it. Tell your friends. Use your wife's email. Just do whatever you got to do. Use that promo code John. Don't need a thank you. Appreciate everyone who is using it. Keep hammering it. Let's dive into the news of the day. The Washington Commanders hired Dan Quinn. Now, if you listen to previous podcasts, I thought Seattle, when it looked like all signs were pointing to them hiring him, was crazy because they fired Pete Carroll, who is a legend. National championship in college, multiple, obviously a Super Bowl, went to another one, resurrected the franchise. To hire one of his former assistants who's not as good as him, that brings a similar culture, I didn't love that. And if you're John Schneider, more than likely, this is your last hire, take a big swing. So I understood, I think they made the right decision. The easy move would have been hiring the guy If you're John Schneider, get this guy who might be a rocket ship and take a swing. Now, the Commanders were in a different spot because let's face it, when you think they got 7 names, and hell, there's been reports that they might change it again, there's a toxicity and a negativity around that franchise. Even though Ron Rivera, high-level guy, good guy, that Dan Snyder stink is all around. Now, I've said in Seattle, if I was a GM, I would hire Vrabel over Dan Quinn. I feel more comfortable with Mike Vrabel, the coach. Now, there's more to hiring a coach. There were rumors he didn't get along with anyone. I sided with Vrabel on that standpoint of I don't know this GM. But you get guys who aren't exactly, positive on a daily basis. It can wear on owners. And if you look at Josh Harris, The last two coaches he's hired in the NBA, they had history at a high level coaching. They were successful. Technically, they're both champions. Doc Rivers and now Nick Nurse. So I think it's fair to assume, because I have pretty good knowledge, not that Adam Peters told me this or anything, but that they wanted, because he did not, that they wanted Ben Johnson, or they were very, very interested in Ben Johnson, as well as they should have been. They have the number 2 pick in the draft. They're going to take a quarterback, you would think. So you would want the best offensive coach available. And this wasn't a great cycle for offensive coaches. It was basically all defensive guys, right? Raheem Morris, defensive coordinator. Vrabel, defensive guy. Mike McDonald, defensive guy. The dude the Panthers hired, no one else was hiring him. So this was Antonio Pierce, former linebacker. Jim Harbaugh was really only going to the Chargers, 1. And 2, he's like this weird hybrid, former quarterback, but he's really wired more like a defensive lineman or a linebacker. So, and let's face it, the Commanders weren't in the Jim Harbaugh business, and he wasn't in their business. Him and the Chargers were meant to happen. I do understand hiring a guy that can handle being at the front of the room, can be a head coach. He's done that and gives you positive momentum. Now, do I think Dan Quinn's upside is a top 5, 8 coach in the NFL? I do not. But I also think when you look at the available options, they're not going to hire Belichick. And if Mike Vrabel, they're not vibing with him, I don't even know if they interviewed him, which I do think it's a mistake to not interview every guy available. I really do. One thing, I spent time around the Raiders and good buddies with Greg Papa, who worked for Al Davis for a long time. And one thing Al Davis always did was interview everybody, because you're just kind of stealing nuggets. 90% of his interviews, I was always told by people around him, were just to gather intel. So I don't quite understand not interviewing every single human available when you have a coaching opening. But I do understand the Dan Quinn hire. I do, because this is there's a negativity, and just it's not positive when you think about the Washington football team Commanders. I hate even calling them the Commanders, because I don't even feel like that's going to be their name in 5 years. So people always say, like, why do you keep messing up their name? Because they fucking change their name all the time. But I understand Josh Harris going, I don't want, if we can't get the number 1 offensive guy, which literally wasn't available because he went back to work. And even that, right? If he's asking for $17, $15 million a year, it's like, wait, we're going to pay a guy $60, $70 million, and there's no guarantee it's going to work. Though I'd probably take that risk. But this is a franchise that can't afford. Like, ultimately, Seattle, like, they can afford to swing for the fences. If it doesn't work, whatever. But they've already been kind of at a high level and a positive level with Pete Carroll. This franchise, like, needs to just get the train back on the tracks. If they could just have 2 straight years of double-digit wins, it's going to be a big deal. I do think he'll just bring some positive momentum to the franchise. Now, from a schematical standpoint, there's no way around it. That final game in Dallas is hard to forget. But I got news for you. Like, one bad game as a coach, just like one bad game as an NFL draft prospect, doesn't mean that much. It really doesn't. It's about the total body of work. Dan Quinn is good friends with Steve Kerr. Bob Myers is playing a big role in this search. Well, Bob Myers, Steve Kerr, Dan Quinn, Adam Peters, John Lynch, and Bob Myers are good buddies. Like, there are a lot of connections. Like, I understand this. And if he would have passed on several other, like, if there would have been multiple Ben Johnsons out there and you would have gone with Dan Quinn, I would have thought this was ludicrous. But just lay out the candidates right now. Like, you're not hiring Belichick because you just hired a GM. So Belichick, let's face it, one thing, I think the whole Belichick thing is kind of crazy. But if he's walking into the organization like, I'm sorry, I kind of need to pick the players, like, Bill, that's kind of on you. Like, I still think you're a big-time coach, and I think it's crazy that Atlanta didn't hire him. But if his number one thing is, like, I got to pick all the players as well as coach the team, which I don't necessarily blame him for saying that, but, like, he's not going to get hired in 2024 when he says that. And once the Commanders hire a general manager first, they're going to hire a coach who's not picking the players. So it was going to be a Mike McDonald, a Ben Johnson, a Dan Quinn. And let's face it, one thing Dan Quinn brings to the table, easy to get along with, like, is just a very, very high character, good soldier. Now, he's very dependent on the GM. And when you're a general manager like Adam Peters, you're a much better GM when you have a good coach. Brett Veach, John Lynch, Les Snead, like, we're not talking about Howie Roseman. Like when they have good coaching staffs, like they look better at their job. I don't care how good the players you're getting people. If your coaching staff doesn't know what they're doing, like part of the unraveling that happened in Atlanta is Matt Ryan started falling off a cliff. Obviously, they lost coordinators, and they started missing on draft picks left and right. Like Thomas Dimitroff didn't do a good job. The big elephant in the room with Dan Quinn, because overall his body of work in Dallas' defensive coordinator has been pretty good. It's going to be offense and his offensive coordinator. And we've seen it. He's gotten offensive coordinators before they leave. Right? They go to him and then they leave. So if you do have success, if you draft, let's just say Drake May or Jaden Daniels, and all of a sudden in a year or two, that guy looks like CJ Stroud, the offensive coordinator is going to get a head coaching job. Like if CJ Stroud has another year like that, Bobby Slowick is a lock head coach. It's just the way it works. So that would be a concern for me for sure. Just looking at it whenever you hire a defensive coach. But one thing we've talked about this earlier in the week, a lot of these interviews have come like, who's your contingent plan? Which I think is also stupid. If you hire John Middlekauff to be your offensive coordinator right now, if he gets a job in 2 years, who are you going to hire? Obviously, things are so fluid in the NFL, you can't keep track of everything, right? People get jobs, people get fired, things don't go well. But I understand it. I'm not going to say like I love it, but I also go, well, who are they really passing on? Like who could they have had? If Mike Vrabel is cool with just getting along with everyone and not picking the players, then I think that's a mistake. But I don't know if he's really cool with that. I don't know if that's really his deal right now. Obviously, Belichick, not interested in that. I think it's pretty clear to say. But once Ben Johnson says no, you're kind of upstream without a paddle. And this is probably the best option when you just look at a guy that can get you pointed in the right direction. Now, more than likely, my guess is in 3 or 4 years, if they're just a consistent, solid team, you're going, do they need the next upgrade? Do they need the better version of this? But that's a good problem to have, right? If you go from Mark Jackson to Steve Kerr, that's first-class problems. That means you're in the playoffs. And let's face it, this Washington team has been a joke for 25 years. Since Dan Snyder bought the team, it's been really bad. And Josh Harris has proven now, once he kind of blew out Sam Hinkie and everybody, and just got normal coaches from Brett Brown to, who was a San Antonio guy, to Doc Rivers, to now Nick Nurse. Like, they like a guy, these last 2 hires, with experience. And I do believe that matters. Like, if you're John Schneider, you've been a GM for 15 years. You believe you can really help the guy. If you're Adam Peters, you've been at a really high level as the number 2. But it does help to be working with a guy who has experience. Because now your suggestions are no longer suggestions. They're your decisions. So being with the guy that goes, well, we did this with this. We used to do this with Pete. One thing, look at Dan Quinn's resume. He went from being Pete Carroll's right-hand guy in their prime, right, the best teams, to Atlanta, where he had some success when he got Kyle Shanahan for sure. I mean, they had, one of the best teams in the league. And then he's been one of the better defensive coordinators the last several years. So his resume, if he was a 45-year-old, would be a no-brainer. I think sometimes there's like this ageist. And listen, I'm guilty of that. Like, I don't really want that guy. Besides Belichick, he's kind of an outlier. But there's a reason no one's talking to Spags. No one wants a 60-year-old who's kicking everyone's ass, right? I mean, no one, even Mike Zimmer, who's like an old curmudgeon, look at his resume. He was pretty successful in Minnesota. He wasn't exactly the village idiot, but he's never going to be a head coach again. And it gets back to Dan Quinn's right kind of at that sweet spot, early mid-50s, before he's never getting a job again. So if you're him, he was 100% going to take whatever he had offered. But he'd been in the mix the last couple of years in Seattle, 2 years ago in Denver, and now in Washington. So if I'm a Washington fan, I'm not throwing a party for this hire. But this isn't some joke hire, right? It's going to come down to his offensive coordinator. And the key with the success is 100% going to be, do they draft the right quarterback? I had a buddy tell me this a while ago when Joe Douglas had all those picks. And we'll get into them here in a second, that they had like over the course of 3 years, a bunch of high picks in the first and second round because of the Jamal Adams trade. And let's just pick an even number. Let's pick 8. Said if we hit on 7 of the 8 of the picks and 6 of them are pro bowlers and all pros, but Zach Wilson's a bust, we're in major trouble. But if we miss on 7 of the 8, they're all scrubs. None of them can play. But Zach Wilson is a top 10 quarterback. Everyone in that building's getting extensions. kind of playing out that way. They're holding on for dear life right now. They had to trade for a 39-year-old guy who tore his Achilles. He tore his Achilles with them, but you know what I mean. So the success of this franchise moving forward is very black and white. Like, obviously, culture matters and drafting good players matter. It's a team game. But is this quarterback good? Because ultimately, I think D'Amico's a stud. And I think he would be good no matter where he coached. But to be really good, and he said this over and over, we go with CJ goes. And if you get a star quarterback, or you don't even need, like, CJ has a chance to be like a top 5 quarterback. If I just get a Dak Prescott, a Kirk Cousins level guy, you got a chance to win every single year. And that matters. That's how you get extensions. And this franchise, this is not the Chiefs or the 49ers. This team has not been winning. They've been a laughingstock. They've been really bad. And that owner's now gone. That stink is now gone. And it's on this franchise to get this quarterback right. And they have a great opportunity. They get the pick of the litter after Caleb Williams. So we'll find out who they have the highest on the draft board, right? You'll know whoever they take at quarterback, you'll know is their number 2 quarterback. Potentially their number 1, because they're not even pointless to even look at Caleb the moment you know, once Chicago, assuming they trade the pick, and who knows, maybe they trade up with Chicago, right? I don't know. Maybe if you're Chicago, you're like, we just trade down 1 and get like their 2nd round pick. I don't know. We'll have to see. We got time to let this all play out. But the success of Dan Quinn and Adam Peters, at least in the short term, is going to hinge on this young quarterback. And I'm fascinated to watch it play out. Now every coaching vacancy is full, and we still have a lot of movement with assistant coaching, and we don't have to speculate anymore because there was a lot of speculation. We didn't know who Washington was going to. We didn't know who Seattle was going to hire. I would say the Carolina hire was a little, I don't want to say out of left field, because what Canellis did with Baker Mayfield this year was really impressive, but longtime position coach who just 1-year coordinator, boom, head coach. Now, I understand why they hired. I mean, probably didn't have many options. Like the Jim Harbaugh thing, no-brainer, right? Even the Adam Peters, or not the Adam Peters, but the Antonio Pierce. I thought the Raiders would be players for Jim Harbaugh. Maybe he wasn't that interested because they didn't have a quarterback. But the moment he was out, like, they weren't hiring all these other guys. They were going to hire Antonio Pierce, and they did. So we can move on and start. Now we can start discussing how these teams are going to play once we know the coaching staffs, who the coordinators are. It's going to be very, very interesting moving forward. Looking for a super offer for Super Bowl 58? DraftKings Sportsbook has you covered. New customers can bet on the big game and turn $5 into $200 instantly in bonus bets. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code JOHN. New customers can bet $5 and get $200 instantly in bonus bets. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of Super Bowl 58, with code JOHN. John, the crown is yours. Jed York talked to the media today and gave a little press conference. Kind of impromptu to all the local guys. I love when a coach or a GM, just gives the local guys some love. And he told this story about 2022. Right? So this was the 23 season, so it was last year. Brock Purdy's rookie season. And he said that Kyle Shannahan grabbed him after a training camp practice or sometime early in training camp and said, I need to talk to you. And he said, listen, I think we might have the best quarterback on the roster, and it's the 7th round pick. We might have found something. Essentially what he said. I heard the way Jed told the story is not exactly how the story was told, but essentially, like, we got something here. And I was thinking about, like, one thing that's never really served me wrong, and I would imagine many people can relate to this, is when your gut tells you something. There are things in life, whether it's as a football coach, whether it's in any business that we do, whether it's in our relationships, that you kind of know early. You're like, God, she's special. We might need to make this a long-term thing. I want this woman to be the mother of my children. Or like, God, this company is something bad is on the horizon. I need to get the fuck out of here. I've had it happen to me twice. When Chip Kelly was hired after Andy was fired, I knew early on after a little, I don't want to say an argument. There was a contentious conversation of me giving my opinion in a draft meeting, Chip kind of firing back, And everyone after, like in the hotel room, while the scouts were saying, was like, I don't know if that went well. I'm like, I don't think so either. And then it was clear. My gut told me this thing was ending. And I had the same thing happen in radio. And my gut told me something's off here. When a boss who had originally hired me had put me on a radio show and we had a lot of success together, left the company. And then we hired this new guy. And it was like, this is not going to work out. This is no chance. And you know it right away. Now, it doesn't mean you make a decision right away. But I think usually when your gut tells you something positively or negatively, you kind of know. And I've been to enough practices in my life to know if you're just like the way I go to practices now, or at least I don't go to as many anymore, but to a training camp practice, if I go to Raider practices or Niner practices, it's kind of hard to tell, right? If I'm just attending practice, like, this guy's making some plays. But when you work for a team, or when I would text people on those teams, I remember texting a guy who worked for the Raiders when they drafted Khalil Mack. And he said after like the second OTA practice, it was so abundantly clear that Khalil Mack was the best player on their team, it wasn't even funny. And sometimes you just know right away. Now, it's harder with later round draft picks because in football, you're not wearing pads at practice. But I knew early on when Kyle had to change his offense for Trey Lance and then to a running offense, kind of like what Lamar did as a young player or what he did with RG3, but Trey wasn't a very good runner. I'm like, I don't think this is going to work. And my gut, I don't, it's not like Kyle texted me this. It's like, I can't imagine Kyle likes doing this at all. And then when they got Brock Purdy, he can just run Kyle's offense. And he told Jed York, I think this guy's going to eventually be our starting quarterback. And I think, now listen, did anyone have any clue that he could be a starting quarterback and throw 30 plus touchdowns and help them get to the Super Bowl? No chance. But I do think you can like someone. And I do think you can know, especially these coaches with a guy running their offense or their defense, like we got something here mentally on a different level. And that's an element that coaches don't talk about publicly a lot. The stuff that, we see the plays. I remember Andy Reid told me this years ago. He's like, the thing about Tyreek Hill that no one talks about because he's catching all these touchdowns and he runs by everyone is he's one of the smartest guys on the team. He's like, I can tell him a play because they're constantly doing shit in practice, right? Inventing plays. I can tell him one time exactly what to do, and he remembers forever. The football IQ in the heyday of Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, and Tyreek Hill was off the fucking charts. Now, Purdy doesn't have those guys' talent. He was a 7th rounder for a reason. Like, a lot of his talent is the intangible stuff. Picked up Kyle's offense like that. Understood the reads like that. Makes the correct decisions like that. Is accurate like that. So coaches, listen, sometimes the pushback of people in the front office, the scouts, the GMs, is we like talent. We like physical attributes. Because over the course of time, if you coach that guy up, he can be a really good player. And coaches like people, ideally you get Tyreek Hill, who's an elite talent and smart, right? Football-wise. So you can give him everything, right? That's what like Kobe, Michael Jordan, Tom Brady, Peyton Manning. Like you get the total package. Ray Lewis. Most guys are somewhere in the middle. Super talented, have some deficiencies. Not as talented, make up for it with try hard and work ethic and smarts, right? When you get the guy that's Peyton Manning or Tom Brady, you become an unstoppable Aaron Rodgers, start rattling off MVPs and dominate, right? But Brock Purdy's a great example of someone who was valued more with the coaches immediately than us on the outside. And I think looking back when the Niners kept him on the roster, listen, it took a broken foot or ankle from Trey Lance and a broken foot from Jimmy Garoppolo, but the coaches liked him and they liked him early. And anytime as a player, and I would recommend this to any guy, the faster you can learn the playbook, as a mid to later round guy, the faster you could make plays in training camp that impress the coaches. It's a tried and true formula. Obviously, effort and being early and being a good guy, all that shit matters. But the easiest way to make a team is not just make plays. It's to know what you're doing. Obviously, you have to have the talent, but if you get drafted, you have football talent. But you'd be shocked how many guys struggle to know what they're doing because it's complex. A lot of these guys come from offenses. What'd I hear? What was the stat? They had someone, the amount of guys in this upcoming draft that were under center. It's like 47 snaps. I don't even want to screw it up, but I remember one time they asked how many guys at a Senior Bowl, this was years ago, had never been under center in college. And like every quarterback raised their hand. So what you're doing in college while you're playing football at quarterback, it doesn't parallel what you're going to end up doing in the pros. Doesn't mean you can't figure it out or learn it or transition, but it is difficult for a lot of guys. And I think Brock Purdy is a good example of one of his traits that when everyone's like, this guy's not good enough, half the league struggles making the right decision. I think a lot of guys, like once you become a starting quarterback or in the league, have a pretty good idea. Like when you're in a meeting room, I can tell you what we're supposed to do against this coverage, when it's this play call, what to audible in, when they're giving you this look. A lot of guys can do that great on a whiteboard in the meeting room with the quarterback coach and the offensive coordinator. It's like, shit, this guy knows what he's talking about. Can talk football like they're Peyton Manning or Tom Brady. Then there's a smaller percentage once you take them to the field in practice that can do that. If you can do that, you're going to impress some people. And then there's the next level of like, how about the game? When you have no clue because that's why training camp and the preseason games are so much different than the regular season. Because you're going up against a defense in a preseason game that is just running their stuff. That is, for the most part, running pretty bland looks. It's not a game plan look. Well, once week one hits, I'm playing whoever, Mike McDonald, Vic Fangio, you name it, Wink Martindale, Dan Quinn, who are giving me all these looks, Spagnuolo. They're like, God, I didn't see this on tape. I didn't know this was coming. And can you still function when you don't know the answers to the test? Because that's football. You don't know the answers to the test when you go into a game. That's what makes Patrick Mahomes and Brady and all these guys that can sustain it forever at such a high level. It's like, football genius. And that's one element of Purdy's game. Listen, he does not have the strongest arm. And he's definitely not the tallest quarterback. So it's not easy for him to see, and he gets some balls batted sometimes. But his knowledge of what to do in big spots, he's also a very instinctive player. And this goes back to the draft. When they drafted Trey Lance, I watched Trey Lance. I went to a lot of practices with Trey Lance, and I watched all his snaps in the 4 games that he started. He's not a natural. It doesn't feel natural. Like you watched him and something fell off. He didn't play fast, right? And he was a, kind of a hybrid player. When you watch some of these young, like Herbert right away, who's a hybrid, big athlete, can move, the game came very natural to him. And I'm not saying he's a perfect player by any means, but it was like there wasn't it just flowed. He played fast. And that's one thing with Brock Purdy. Now, when he gets in trouble, when he feels a little overwhelmed, he definitely doesn't. But he is a guy that as the game goes, he's a very instinctive and natural player. And that's how he makes up for some of his physical limitations. Obviously benefits from a good coordinator and good talent around him. But, I think that's a pretty telling quote that it's why I said this entire offseason. Trey Lance was done. He was never going to be the backup quarterback. They hired Sam Darnold to be the backup quarterback. And everyone and, some of these gutter rats, as I call them on the internet, the big Niner fans that for some reason wanted Trey Lance to be the starting quarterback. I'm like, guys, he's not. They signed Sam Darnold. He's going to be the backup. Purdy's going to start if he's healthy, and Sam Darnold's going to be the backup. I didn't quite know they were going to trade him before week 1, but you know what Jed told you today? Kyle had kind of turned on Trey 2 years ago that said, this guy can't run my offense. And I'll say this, it was a monumental mistake. It's why you don't make decisions out of desperation. Anything in life, right? If you're fighting with your wife, don't try to have a kid to save the marriage, right? If you're going bankrupt, I wouldn't recommend going to Vegas and putting it all on black, right? Or put it all in one stock to hopefully double, right? Just sometimes when you are in a desperate situation, you just got to take a deep breath. But when you got to be able to pivot. One of Belichick's greatest strengths, I always thought as a head coach, he missed a lot of picks, right? He'd get rid of them after like 2 or 3 years. Like, God, Bill just drafted that guy in the second round like a year and a half ago. He's already traded. And he had the equity and the juice to do it. Most guys do not. And they play it out forever. The Jets were done with Zach Wilson 2 years ago. They were done with him. But it's like Aaron Rodgers can save him, and they kept him. They should have got rid of him when they knew. And he would have had some value. Maybe you get rid of him for like a 3rd-round pick or whatever. This is after his 2nd year, even as ugly as it was, because someone would have still been desperate enough. And now they're in a position when no one's touching that guy. Probably have to cut him. So I just think that, listen, they made a mistake and they got lucky, that the seventh rounder can really play. But once they knew it, they pivoted and they pivoted fast. So, and that's a big reason why they're here right now. I don't even think they're a playoff team with Trey Lance, and Jimmy Garoppolo is terrible now. So sometimes the football gods, when you're aggressive, take care of you. Last but not least, speaking about the Jets, the report that there was a long athletic article by Diana Rossini and some other guy, like an in-depth, pretty salacious stuff on the Jets. And the thing that stood out to me the most was Robert Saleh. Remember, there was a report late November, early December, after Zach Wilson I think he got a concussion and been kind of benched, and they were going to go back to him. And one of the reports was Zach Wilson didn't want to go back and didn't want the job back. Like, I don't want to go back, and you guys kind of gave up on me. And then remember, Aaron Rodgers went on McAfee and talked a bunch of shit, like, who's leaking this stuff? And then Robert Saleh called a staff meeting and basically called every single coach out on his staff, saying, if you come clean right now of a story that was true, I won't hold it against you. And I'm threatening to check phones. And I think the reason you're in those positions is because of the situation they put themselves in with Aaron Rodgers. If they had just played it out, and I don't blame them for trading for Aaron Rodgers, but the moment you did that, it threw the whole building off kilter because everything was dependent on him. And one line in that article is like, Aaron Rodgers isn't the assistant GM, Joe Douglas is. Essentially, Aaron Rodgers is the boss. And I think that's pretty risky, man. And it clearly blew up. And Robert Saleh is a high character, good guy. People really like him. But when you find yourself in this situation where everyone feels like they're holding on for dear life, and the moment Rodgers gets injured, everyone kind of scrams like a cockroach. And when Robert Saleh is calling out his coaching staff, Robert, it's not one guy. It's probably 7 guys in there. No one trusts the operation right now. And this gets back to when you can't have a long-term vision and the willingness to not get in these desperate situations. And one of the stories was that Robert Saleh didn't want to draft Zach Wilson. He wanted to keep Sam Darnold and to trade the pick. So already all these stories, and they just relieved basically the number 2 in command, Rex Hogan, the other day. So I think put the pieces of the puzzle together. He was probably a leaker. But when not everyone's on the same page and everyone starts backstabbing each other, because that happens all the time in the NFL, your organization is fucked. That group and cohort of people is done. I picked the Jets to, I think, win the division this year. I definitely thought if Rodgers played all 17 games, they would be a playoff game. I don't think that's necessarily a fact looking back because their offensive line was so bad. Here's what I do know. No matter what happens this offseason, I'm betting against the Jets. Their coordinator feels well over his head. I don't think Nathaniel Hackett knows what he's doing. Robert Saleh has clearly lost control of his operation because the reality, the shitty part about football is it's this ultimate team game. But when things start going poorly, players are getting a lot of money, so whatever, I can point the finger a little bit. But if I'm making $7 million, who cares? I'll keep playing hard. As a coach, he'll easily point the finger at me. And if he gets fired, I'm going to get fired too. So everyone kind of starts fighting for themselves. Yet the entire message of the coaching staff is stay together, team, fight through adversity. Yet the moment there's adversity, all these guys making $500,000 to $2 or $3 million non-head coach, and the head coach making $7, $8, $9 million, start just stabbing each other in the back. The funniest part about this article is the main salacious line of Robert Saleh getting all of his coaches in a room calling out who leaked the article was this article with the leak about that thing happening. So it's just nonstop leaks. The dam is broken. It's a fucking disaster. There's no way to rein it in. And a huge part of this is winning really makes everybody happy. It was well reported. I said this, but other people have said it still. Wink Martindale and Brian Daboll's relationship was the exact same 2 years ago. Was the exact same. He couldn't stand him. but they made the playoffs. They were the 6th seed. They were in the second round of the playoffs. So when you win, it's like, even when you don't like each other, hey, things are going well. We're all getting praise. You do it. The moment you start heading toward the top 5 in the draft, that's when the machetes come out. I just watched the show on Netflix. Is it Grizzadella? It's this famous drug lord who lived in Miami, who did a bunch of business with Pablo in the cocaine era in like the 80s. And it's just, they're just beheading people. It's just a war zone. It's like a more chaotic mafia. I mean, you'll just cut someone's head off, leave them in the middle of the street. It's crazy. No one dies in the NFL, but it's the same mentality. It's like I'm a sucker for mob shows. You give me any mob show, Gotti, yeah, any of the Godfather, you name it, real movies, shows, docuseries, Narcos, Netflix, I'll watch it all. They all tend to like sign this code and be loyal to each other. The moment shit falls off the rails, everyone always turns on each other. It's actually a great kind of example of human psychology. Because I truly believe when you're making money in the mob or in the cartel, like, and you're a higher up guy, like, you're hand in hand with everybody. But the moment your ass is on the firing line, like, hey, you're going to go to jail for 50 years. Hey, you're going to go to jail for that murder. Well, hey, I might have murdered one guy, but let me tell you about the boss who murdered 17. And they start singing like a canary. Those old days of maybe the 40s and 50s where people stayed quiet, that clearly ended toward the 80s and 90s. And right now, I wouldn't trust a soul if I was in criminal activity to keep their mouth shut when things went wrong. Same thing always happens in the NFL. The moment adversity is the moment you start losing, and the moment controversy surrounds your team in terms of players and players acquisition, no one ever wants to take blame. You see it with the Atlanta Falcons. Like, how I understand Arthur Smith did not do a good job. Listen, his team was headed nowhere, the quarterback situation. But, like, was he alone in all this? Like, what about the Terry Fontenot and Rich McKay? They're like, just this idiot. Not my fault. Not my problem. So, the Jets, man, if they were a stock, I would short them, and I would short them hard. And they're not even expensive stock right now.